Sehr geehrter Herr Professor Warren, sehr geehrte Teilnehmer der heutigen Roundtable-Diskussion, liebe Frau Deitelhoff, lieber Rainer, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich, Sie zu der ersten Jahreskonferenz der Clusterinitiative ConTrust, Vertrauen und Konflikt an der Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt am Main begrüßen zu können. Nach langer Zeit können wir uns heute endlich wieder in Präsenz, meine Damen und Herren, ich begrüße natürlich auch die im Livestream, zumindest teilweise in Präsenz, hier an dieser Stelle treffen. Und es tut gut, dass diese Initiative sich hier zusammenfindet in den Räumlichkeiten von Normative Ordnungen. Dieser Ort steht seit vielen Jahren für erfolgreiche und exzellente Forschung mit nationaler und internationaler Stärke. Ihre Initiative ConTrust, mit der Sie sich auf eine mögliche Antragstellung in der nächsten Exzellenzstrategierunde vorbereiten und die über die kommenden 4 Jahre vom Land und der Goethe-Universität finanziert wird, baut auf dem Fundament von Normative Orders ein. Ich bin mir sicher, sie wird an die erfolgreiche Arbeit anknüpfen und zugleich durch organisatorische, methodische und nicht zuletzt inhaltliche Neuorientierung neue innovative Wege gehen. In organisatorischer Hinsicht erweitert ConTrust als eine gemeinsame Initiative der Goethe-Universität und des Leibniz-Institut HSFK, mit dem wir eine herausragende Partnerschaft pflegen, den Forschungsverbund Normative Ordnungen, was die Initiative selbst nachhaltig stärkt. Aber gerade in der jetzt stattfindenden Aufbau dieser Initiierungsphase ist es von besonderer Bedeutung, auch die Möglichkeiten weiterer Partnerschaften auszuführen. Nicht um der bloßen Erweiterung der Anzahl willen, sondern mit dem Augenmerk auf die strategische Stärkung des Verbundes zur optimalen Positionierung für die Bearbeitung der Forschungsfragen. Auch methodisch stellt die Initiative ConTrust eine erhebliche Erweiterung gegenüber Normative Orders dar. Waren Inter- und Transdisziplinarität bereits im Rahmen von Normative Orders schon von großer Bedeutung, so ist das Spektrum der beteiligten Fächer nochmals erweitert worden. In ConTrust tragen Rechts- und Wirtschaftswissenschaften, Soziologie, Sozialpsychologie, Politologie, Philosophie, Film- und Literaturwissenschaften ihren Teil zur Bearbeitung der Fragestellung bei. Schon mit dieser Kombination ist man zukunftsfähig aufgestellt, ist ein Alleinstellungsmerkmal ab. Und dennoch gilt auch hier, auch in Bezug auf die Methodik kritisch zu prüfen, ob durch gezielte Erweiterung der methodischen Expertise das Konsortium nicht doch noch gestärkt wird. Das sage ich nicht, weil ich als Naturwissenschaftler etwas vermisse, sondern mit Blick auf die bestmögliche Aufstellung für die Untersuchung von Vertrauen im Konflikt, dem sich ConTrust inhaltlich aus inter- und transdisziplinären Blickwinkeln zuwendet. In Bezug auf die inhaltliche Ausrichtung finde ich besonders den Untertitel Ihres Projektes sehr spannend. Politisches Zusammenleben unter Bedingungen der Ungewissheit. Denn das trifft es genau auf den Punkt. Dass wir in ungewissen Zeiten leben, hat die Pandemie besonders deutlich gemacht. Aber auch schon vor Corona verschärften sich allerorts gesellschaftliche Spannungen und Krisen der Demokratie wurden diagnostiziert. Was die Klimakrise auslösen kann, ist zu erahnen und doch kaum vorstellbar. Und auch die Transformation in die digital begleitete und einige mögen sogar prognostizieren, digital dominierte Welt birgt Ungewissheiten über die gesellschaftlichen Strukturen von morgen. Im Einklang mit unserer gesamtuniversitären Mission als Goethe-Universität auf Lösungen für unter anderem die gesellschaftlichen Herausforderungen des 21. Jahrhunderts hin zu forschen, wollen Sie, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, als Konsortium diese Krisendiagnosen nicht einfach wiederholen, sondern suchen nach einem Gegenmittel, nach dem Kit, der moderne, komplexe und pluralistische, durch Konflikte gekennzeichnete Gesellschaften zusammenbringt. Und dafür sind Sie eingebettet in eine exzellente wissenschaftliche Landschaft an der Goethe-Universität, die sich unter anderem mit der Betrachtung der religiösen Dynamiken, der Robustheit der Natur oder der Entwicklung von Strategien gegen Pandemie beschäftigt. Eine Wissenschaftslandschaft also, die Interaktions- oder Reflexionsfläche für Ihre Arbeit, die Sie für Ihre eigene Betrachtung nutzen können, ja, nutzen sollten. Für Ihre Antworten erforschen Sie rationale Formen des Zusammenhangs. Vertrauen, wir haben gerade über Vertrauen gesprochen, es bahnen sich auch Krisen an, spielt eine zentrale Rolle. Wie Vertrauen von Ihnen gefasst wird, ist innovativ. Denn Vertrauen wird von Ihnen eben nicht als Gegenbegriff zu gesellschaftlichen Konflikten gefasst, sondern Sie gehen der These nach, ob und wenn ja, inwiefern Vertrauen nicht auch und gerade in Konflikten entstehen kann und entsteht. Dass es sich dabei um ein wichtiges Thema handelt, erscheint mir offensichtlich. Gerade angesichts der gesellschaftlichen Zerwürfnisse der vergangenen Jahre, die sich zum Beispiel im globalen Erstarken rechtspopulistischer Bewegungen und Parteien zeigen. Daher freue ich mich besonders, dass dieses hochaktuelle Thema von Ihnen in neuer Herangehensweise und aus vielfältigen Perspektiven untersucht wird. ConTrust ist für die Goethe-Universität ein Schwerpunkt von großer Bedeutung als Leuchtturmprojekt des Profilbereichs Orders und Transformation, tief verwurzelt in der Universität, in beidem, in Forschung und Leben. Unser Ziel als Forscherinnen und Forscher, als Goethe-Universität ist es, bei der nächsten Runde der Exzellenzstrategie von Bund und Ländern erfolgreich zu sein. Dafür haben wir, das Ministerium für Wissenschaft und Kunst, einen herzlichen Dank für die Weitsicht an dieser Stelle an unsere Ministerin Frau Dorn, die ja gleich digital zu sehen sein wird, und die Goethe-Universität einen Ermöglichungsraum geschaffen, den Sie, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, jetzt konsequent nutzen können. Aber die Goethe-Universität unterstützt die Entwicklung ihres Vorhabens darüber hinaus durch gezielte strategische Maßnahmen. Durch die Schärfung des Forschungsprofils und die Etablierung der Forschungsprofilbereiche erhöhen wir die Attraktivität für herausragende nationale und internationale Forschende und Studierende, fördern Inter- und Transdisziplinarität, stimmen Berufungen stärker auf die strategischen Ziele der Goethe-Universität ab und stärken insgesamt die Forschungsexzellenz. Ich freue mich, dass der Kollege Forst neben seinen anderen Aufgaben als Gründungssprecher des Profilbereichs hier ebenfalls maßgeblich beteiligt sein. Die engagierten Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler, die ConTrust in den kommenden Jahren vorantreiben werden, werden von international rekrutierten Postdocs und Promovierenden unterstützt. Auch hier hat die Goethe-Universität durch den strategischen Ausbau der Förderung der Great Centers oder die Gründung der Jungen Akademie die strukturellen Voraussetzungen optimiert, junge Kolleginnen und Kollegen gute Bedingungen für ihre Karriereentwicklung zu ermöglichen. Darüber hinaus freue ich mich sehr, dass es in Kürze noch eine große Zahl an Neuberufungen quer über die Fachbereiche und Fächergrenzen hinweg geben wird, die diesen ohnehin schon stark aufgestellten Verbund noch zusätzlich bereichern. Auch hier ist die Goethe-Universität nicht untätig. Ein Programm zur Ansiedlung von erfolgreichen Nachwuchsgruppen als B1-Tenure-Track-Professoren wird den Möglichkeitsraum der Initiativen signifikant erweitern. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, lassen Sie mich zum Schluss noch dem Sprecherteam des Projektes, Nicole Deitelhoff und Rainer Forst, herzlich danken. Aber auch allen anderen Mitgliedern von ConTrust, die sich auf den Weg gemacht haben. Aber ein ganz herzlicher Dank auch den Mitarbeiterinnen und Mitarbeitern der Geschäftsstelle, die, ich sage es jetzt mal, nicht nachhaltigkeitsbewusst, dem Öl eines jeden Projektes, ohne den der Motor nicht funktionieren wird. Ich wünsche Ihnen und uns für die Zukunft eine erfolgreiche und fruchtbare Zusammenarbeit und Ihnen nun eine spannende Eröffnungskonferenz, interessante Vorträge und anregende Diskussionen. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, leider muss ich mich jetzt von Ihnen gleich wieder verabschieden, da bereits mein Paralleltermin läuft. Aber ich wollte es mir unter keinen Umständen nehmen lassen, Ihre erste Konferenz hier heute persönlich zu eröffnen. Ich wünsche Ihnen viel Erfolg und viele kreative Ideen. Dankeschön.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident Schleiff, sehr geehrter Herr Professor Forst, sehr geehrte Frau Professorin Deitelhoff, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Zunächst möchte ich Ihnen gratulieren. Die Clusterinitiative ConTrust der Goethe-Universität und der Hessischen Stiftung Friedens- und Konfliktforschung ist eines von 6 Projekten, die das Hessische Ministerium für Wissenschaft und Kunst für 4 Jahre fördern wird. Der Forschungsverbund Normative Ordnungen war in der Vergangenheit und ist immer noch ein Gravitationszentrum solcher Spitzenforschung in den Geistes- und Sozialwissenschaften. Bei meinem Besuch im März 2020 konnte ich mich selbst von der Qualität der hier durchgeführten Arbeit überzeugen. Ich freue mich daher, dass ConTrust aus der Mitte dieses Forschungsverbundes entstanden ist und bin zuversichtlich, dass diese neue Initiative die nationale und internationale Sichtbarkeit noch einmal erhöhen wird. Vertrauen im Konflikt, politisches Zusammenleben unter Bedingungen der Ungewissheit. Das ist ein hochaktuelles Thema. Konflikte sind in gesellschaftlichen Kontexten unumgänglich. Das wurde nicht erst in der Corona-Pandemie deutlich. Dennoch gehen wir zumeist davon aus, dass Auseinandersetzungen nicht eskalieren, sondern produktiv ausgetragen werden können. Der Grund für diese Zuversicht ist Vertrauen. Doch wie bildet sich Vertrauen? Was sind seine Ursprünge? Ihre heutige erste Jahreskonferenz markiert den Auftakt zur Erforschung dieser so wichtigen Frage. Dabei gehen Sie gleich in mehreren Hinsichten unkonventionell vor, denn Sie gehen keinesfalls davon aus, dass es sich bei Vertrauen und Konflikt um Gegenbegriffe handelt, sondern wollen die Hypothese erforschen, dass sich Vertrauen im und durch Konflikt zeigt, bildet und bewährt. Ihre Forschung ist interdisziplinär angelegt und zielt zudem auf den gegenseitigen Austausch von Wissenschaft und Öffentlichkeit. Als hessische Staatsministerin für Wissenschaft und Kunst unterstütze ich dieses Vorgehen, weil uns gerade die vergangenen Jahre gezeigt haben, wie wichtig ein Austausch zwischen Wissenschaft, Politik und Gesellschaft ist und dass ein Nebeneinander uns als Gesellschaft insgesamt nicht weiter voranbringt. Gerade die großen Umbrüche, die uns bevorstehen, die erfordern einen breiten und einen evidenzbasierten gesellschaftlichen Austausch. Und deswegen wünsche ich Ihnen für die heutige Konferenz und Ihre Forschung in den nächsten Jahren alles Gute.
So great. Good afternoon. My name is Enrico. I'm the director of the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, so the other, or one of the 2 speakers of our initiative. I would have begun with dear President Schleiff, dear Enrico, but he's already gone, so I can shorten a little bit. So, dear colleagues, and of course, dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure, and I would like to add also with great excitement, that we may welcome you today to ConTrust in audio conference, live and in person, here in the Normative Orders building on campus. This conference is not as big nor as festive as we might have anticipated when we planned for ConTrust in the beginning, but already being in a position that we can invite to a conference in person in a real world room is amazing, and it's lifting our spirits, and it makes us look forward to today's discussion, but also, of course, to tomorrow's discussion. The pandemic situation, with all its uncertainties and the conflict it has given and still does give rise to between individuals, within families, among different social groups, or between states on the global level, on the distribution of resources, the adequacy of political regulations and of prevention measures, the ranking between different values and principles, or of social groups and their relevance to society, etc., has already left deep marks within societies. And it has brought forward, I think, also a new kind of social uncertainty about the others in society and on the prospects of political coexistence with these others. This development is paradigmatic for the kind of questions that ConTrust aims to tackle during the next years to come. How can society like ours, irrevocably pluralized, in which traditional certainties, religious bonds, or shared cultural values seem to have evaporated under the pressure of continuing and even accelerated globalization and social differentiation, manage these conflicts? How can societies like this live through these conflicts and crises without risking and ultimately destroying the fundament for the political coexistence of their members in the future? How do such societies sustain trust despite these conflicts and crises and under conditions of uncertainty where at times even the criteria for truth are heavily disputed? Or is this already the wrong question to begin with? And this is, of course, where ConTrust is situating itself. Are there circumstances under which societies could even create, or at least nurture, trust within and through conflict? And if so, how do they do this? What do these circumstances look like? What kind of trust, what forms of trust can be created within and through conflict? Is it a form of trust conducive to open and pluralist societies? How do institutions and procedures feature in conflicts to at least sustain trust? And how much, and again, what kind of uncertainty can be absorbed by institutions or by procedures in conflict without destroying trust among members of society or towards their shared institutions? These are, I guess, just some of the rather thorny questions lying ahead of us, and we are more than glad that you have decided to join us tonight with our start to look for answers to them. And I think I have it. Here it is. Before I now hand over to my colleague Rainer Forst to introduce to you today's keynote speaker, Mark Warren, who I think doesn't need any introduction, but at least he will get one, I would like also to express our deep gratitude towards all members of the Office of Normative Orders. And I will not actually mention all of them in person because then I will miss someone, and this is not a good idea. But I have, of course, to mention at least two of them. That is our coordinator, Dr. Tobias Wille, and our managing director, internally just called the indispensable Rebecca Schmidt, for the relentless work and support in making this conference, despite the pandemic, its crisis and conflict and uncertainty, possible. By also, I guess, creating a sense of trust among our guests. We have seen all the features that we have in place so that you feel secure and can trust us, but also, of course, within the institution in allowing us to come together and begin to probe our assumptions about trust and conflict. So thank you so much for making this happen. Looking forward to our discussions tonight, and I would like to hand over to Rainer to introduce Mark Warren. Thank you.
Dear Nicole, dear friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, especially dear Mark Warren, who is with us from Vancouver at an early hour over there, even though with the time change, he won an hour as compared to us. So it's not that terrible. So thanks for being there. So very warm welcome from my side too, and a word of thanks to our President Schleiff, who had to leave, and to Minister Dorn. We're really very grateful for their support, which is essential for the project we are pursuing here. Now, as Nicole said, there are many open, she said, thorny, that's a good term, questions in many areas for our research at ConTrust, as for anyone who wants to understand the dynamics of conflict and trust in contemporary societies. But there was one question that we discussed so far, which was very easily solved, namely whom we should ask to deliver the keynote for our first general conference. For simply speaking, Mark Warren is Mr. Democratic Trust, as his contributions to this topic, though published over the past 20 years or so, are already classics in that field. Thus, it is a great pleasure to have you here, Mark, and also thank you for joining our advisory board. We're very grateful to you for doing that. Mark Warren holds the Emeritus Chair in the Study of Democracy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, where he was founding director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, a center that brings forth great people, some of whom we had the pleasure to work with here at Normative Orders, and also we had him as a guest before. Mark's research deals, apart from issues of social and political trust, with a number of questions such as deliberative democracy and institutional innovations to raise levels of public justification and deliberation, connecting new forms of citizens' participation, about which he does also empirical research, new forms of participation and a representative democracy. So let me mention some of his most important book publications. As for many, and Martin Zahn and others will agree, who want to understand the dynamics and complexities of modern societies, Mark's first book was devoted to Nietzsche. It is called Nietzsche and Political Thought. His 2001 award-winning book on democracy and association has been an essential contribution to research on civil society and associations conducive to democracy, very much in Alexis de Tocqueville's spirit. Of course, we also owe him the important collection he edited and contributed to, called Democracy and Trust from 1999, And he also co-edited the book Designing Deliberative Democracy, and the forthcoming, he's co-editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Deliberative Democracy. In his work on political trust, to be found in numerous journal articles, collections, and handbooks, Warren discusses the questions we are interested in a highly illuminating and productive way, such as the seeming paradox of democracy as being based on both trust and distrust, or in Frankfurt dialectical terms, how democratic institutions manage to channel distrust so that trust can emerge. Mark is also a critical theorist in not trusting trust, at least not until it stands the test of public justification. He discusses the role of media in generating trust, as we do. He suggests terms such as engaged distrust or that of second-order political trust, which are important for our thinking about the miracle, as we sometimes call it. I think Nicole invented that term. Therefore, use it with care. The miracle, how modern societies cannot just exist, but also progress if things go well, despite deep and to quite some extent, as we know, unsolved conflicts. Most of all, Born is an exemplar for how to combine, but also to separate clearly normative and empirical research. That is what we aim at in our interdisciplinary enterprise, and that is one of the reasons for being so grateful to you for joining us from the West Coast, and we hope to have you over in person as soon as this is possible. So, dear Mark, thank you, and the digital floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much to Rainer and Nicole and the ConTrust project, the Normative Orders Institution, such an impressive organization. Thanks for inviting me to speak. It's really an honor and a pleasure, and I really wish I could be there with you today. Now, I want to talk today about trust in relation to democratic politics and government, focusing on really surveying the dimensionality of the problem. The background, as you know, is the worry that the developed democracies, in these developed democracies, trust in government is in decline, as is social trust, that is our trust in one another. Of course, these trends vary by context, and certainly some of the alarm is driven by the political situation in the US, which hopefully doesn't generalize, as some of us fear, to Germany and other OECD democracies. But just to give you an idea of how much alarm there is in the US and those of us who border on the US, here's a composite index of trust in government from the American National Election Studies website. You can see that trust in government has fallen since the measurements started in the late 1950s, with some variations driven by partisanship, with higher levels of distrust during democratic administrations, probably because the discourse of distrust is deepest on the right, combined with variations in issue saliency, so that when people are focused more on security, as in the post 9/11 period, they tend to trust government a little bit more. Oops. Behind this trend is the very common view that those who are running government don't have the interests of everyone in view, suggesting that a basic condition for trust is eroding. The COVID crisis pandemic, of course, has now really exposed the depths of these rifts and problems. Now, the next slide is, sorry, my computer is being a little bit slow here. The next slide is from the World Values Survey, which shows that what we call generalized trust, that is general trust with one another, measured by a survey question that asks respondents to indicate whether most people can be trusted or you can't be too careful. As you can see, most people since the 1990s say that you can't be too careful. The numbers from the most recent world values wave are consistent with this trend. Now, this said, I don't have the skills, the knowledge to dig more deeply into these indicative empirics. So what I want to do rather, sorry about the dog, he'll be quiet here in a minute, many hazards of Zoom. What I want to do rather is talk about the dimensionality of the problem. Before we ask, should we worry? Ideally, what kinds of trust does a democracy need? And to what extent does a democracy require distrust? And what kinds of trust and distrust undermine democracy? Now, let me begin with some very basic terms. By democracy, I'm simply going to mean the institutions and associations that enable people to engage in collective self-government. By trust, I mean an individual's judgment that another person is motivated and competent to act in that individual's interest and will do so without overseeing or monitoring. A trust relationship is established when those who trust are met with trustworthy responses, those who are trusted. Now, as a general matter, trust relationships are really important for both individuals and their societies. They're the building blocks of social cooperation, and every good trust relationship expands collective capacities. I trust that you trust me, and when we establish this trust relationship, we can simply accomplish a lot more together. Trust relationships are highly efficient since they don't require the high costs of monitoring and sanctioning. Trust relationships can capture, build upon, and expand the goodwill, knowledge, and creativity of individuals. Existentially, trust relationships provide security and certainty. They allow us to take the goodwill of others for granted. Trust enables collective actions that people experience as extensions of, rather than burdens upon, their securities and freedom. So life in a society without trust, without all of these features, would be, to borrow from Hobbes, a life that would be nasty, brutish, and short. Now, whatever else democracy is, it should be the kind of political system that protects and builds on these benefits of trust relationships, just because trust helps to expand the domains of collective self-rule. But democratic systems can't build on trust relationships in a straightforward way. So here's the problem. Trust relationships expose individuals to the ill will of others. When individuals trust, they're judging that those they trust will have goodwill toward them. But democratic systems are, of course, ways of responding to politics. That is, contexts within which there's conflict over purposes, ways, means of organizing collective powers for collective purposes, including the coercive powers of government. So political relationships are not naturally conducive to trust. Indeed, democracies emerge from distrust, particularly the elite powers, the distrust of elite powers. Jeremy Bentham famously asked, whom ought we to distrust, if not those to whom is committed great authority with great temptations to abuse it. When it comes to politics, a basic condition of trust relationships, convergent interests that predict the goodwill of others, simply can't be taken for granted. And yet, democratic systems can and should build trust relationships while limiting relationships of distrust. It is in part because democracies can capture the advantages of trust relationships that they are, on average, freer, more creative, wealthier, happier, healthier, and less corrupt than non-democracies. So the relationship between democracy and trust seems paradoxical. A political system that's built on distrust is nonetheless one within which trust relationships are essential. But the paradox is only apparent. It's the result, as are so many things in political theory, of overly general categories. So what I want to accomplish in the rest of the talk is a bit of conceptual precision about the relationship between democracy and trust, and hopefully about what the problems are, and where we should worry. So I'll do this in several steps. First, I want to generalize about how democratic institutions should structure trust relationships. Second, I'll look at trust from the perspective of citizens, why they need it, and how it should help us focus our political participation. That is, where we trust we don't need to participate, and where we distrust we should. Following these general ideas, I want to specify trust problems a little more closely by distinguishing between three very different types of democracy supporting trust relationships, what I'll be calling social trust, first order trust in government, and second order trust in political institutions. I'll also note several kinds of trust relationships that undermine democracy. And I'll wrap up by noting that good trust relationships are essential to democracy and should be understood as common pool resources that are both hard to build and easy to despoil. Let's start with the democracy side of the problem. All constitutional democracies organize and support trust in some domains while channeling distrust into others. They secure trust relationships in four ways. First, they protect trust in society. Second, they separate the political domains of government from the service and regulatory agencies and ministries of government. Third, they channel distrust into these political domains. And fourth, they empower the monitoring of political relationships by citizens as well as by specialized oversight bodies. So first, protecting generalized trust. As Tocqueville famously observed, democracies do well when people can associate for common purposes. People who can associate can get things done. They can start enterprises, solve common problems, they can represent interest to others, including governments. They will tend to have the confidence to use the powers of democratic citizenship. A key precursor of these associative capacities are trust relationships among people within society. Democracies protect these relationships through rights that protect, for example, speech, conscience, and association. Rights don't, of course, directly produce trust relationships among people, but they protect the social spaces within which horizontal trust relationships can grow, and with them, the associative dimensions of a confident and able citizenry. Constitutional democracies also separate the political parts of government designed to manage conflict, especially legislatures and elected executives, from the agencies responsible for providing broadly agreed public goods like security and economic statistics, healthcare and employment insurance, and countless other things that we expect our governments to deliver in equitable and impartial ways. Ideally, these parts of government are organized by function, professionalized, and protected from political agendas and patronage. Also, ideally, these parts of government can be trusted because there's a convergence of interest between citizens and the purposes of agencies. Tellingly, those who hold positions within these parts of government, civil services, servants, judges, appointed regulators, and the like, are said to hold a public trust. In contrast to the political parts of government, legislatures, elected executives, and so on, parts of the judiciaries sometimes, typically don't satisfy general requirements for trust just because they are political and partial. So in the same way, democracies channel distrust into the political branches of government, especially legislatures, but also elected executives and their cabinets. Democracies, in other words, institutionalize distrust. They affirm distrust as a natural part of politics by acknowledging conflicting interests and providing them spaces for expression. So maybe we shouldn't worry if citizens have low trust in the political institutions of government, as trust would, on average, be misplaced. But we probably should worry if citizens generalize distrust to those parts of government that are designed to hold a public trust. And then finally, of course, in democracy, citizens should oversee their representatives, monitoring their words and deeds. As Republican political theorists have long emphasized, democracies require citizens that are vigilant in overseeing those areas in which interests diverge. A key achievement of democratic institutions is that they neither suppress conflict nor deny the distrust that accompanies them. Rather, democracies empower partisans to pursue their interests and values through arguments, advocacy, voting, and so on, while denying them non-democratic powers such as coercion and economic blackmail. Competitive elections help to empower distrustful monitoring through the possibility of removing and replacing political elites. All democracies, of course, make extensive use of oversight, especially by independent auditors or agencies. And finally, democracies make public most information about decision-making, so citizens have the information they need to carry out this kind of monitoring. Within these relationships of distrust, however, there are two other key elements that depend upon trust. First, and most importantly, the procedures that enable publicity and empower monitoring must themselves be trustworthy. Second, political representatives must be trustworthy in the limited and specific sense that their actions are publicly knowable in ways that are sufficient for citizens to make the judgments that motivate their votes. Distrust can only be institutionalized if there's a high trust in the institutions that enable politics to be channeled into voting and talking. I'll come back to this point later. If these ways and means of structuring trust and distrust are working, then over time, the interests of citizens and elites should tend to come together. This kind of convergence should help to produce the conditions of trust in society and the non-political parts of government as issues are settled. But this kind of trust creation works only because distrust is empowered and then channeled into the democratic media of public discourse and voting. So democracies tend to be associated with more trust within society and of government relative to non-democratic systems. If this is the case, it's almost certainly because they recognize distrust and channel it into public politics. I'm going to come back to a couple of these points as well. But before I do, I want to consider trust from the standpoint of citizens' political participation. Democracies have high expectations of citizens. We're supposed to use our political powers to learn, engage, and pressure. We're supposed to use our powers to direct our governments. But none of this can be involved in but a few of the decisions that affect our lives. We're all limited by scarcities of time, attentiveness, and knowledge. Now, in standard democratic theory, representative democracies solve this problem through divisions of labor in politics and governance. Electoral democracies enable citizens to hand the job of making laws and policies over to political professionals. Professional civil servants manage the day-to-day business of governing and provide both governments and societies with expert information. Citizens can join associations to represent them on specific issues, or sometimes to partner in governing. Through these divisions of labor, democracies manage complexities in a way that far exceeds the capacities of any group of individuals or any individual. But of course, most of these divisions of labor involve trust relationships. Every division introduces principal-agent relationships. As principals, citizens should be able to use their powers of voting, speaking, organizing, pressuring, and so on, to select and monitor their agents, ensuring that their interests and values are served. But even in an ideal world with ideal citizens, the demands on citizens to monitor are more extensive than any could possibly manage. So this is another reason why trust matters, even to organizing distrust. Ideally, citizens are not monitoring every agent, but rather they would trust that most of their agents are aligned with their interests, and they forego the cost of monitoring while focusing their scarce participatory resources on those agents where the conditions of trust are weak or absent. Decisions about when to participate, when to monitor, and when to trust also require judgment, and trust decisions, like any other decision, can be made well or badly. So good trust decisions by citizens are necessary in large-scale complex democracies, just so they can direct their scarce participatory resources to those areas where distrust is appropriate. In dividing their participatory labors, though, citizens often make poor trust decisions. They place their trust in agents who abuse or betray the trust placed in them. Or they may distrust agents who, in fact, have their best interest in view and thus misdirect and squander their scarce participatory resources. Or they may generalize distrust to such a degree that they withdraw from politics into alienated citizenship, concluding that all government officials and politicians are corrupt and none are to be trusted. Now, this kind of generalized distrust is one of the forces that is most corrosive of democracy today. And of course, it's this kind of distrust that can be mobilized by authoritarian populists, a point I'll also come back to. Now, up to this point, I've been considering trust from the perspective of what it does for democracy. I want to shift perspectives now and look at different kinds of trust according to how they support or undermine democracy. It should be clear from the analysis so far that the concept of trust has a general form as well as many different subtypes. So we need to conceptualize trust a bit more closely, identifying the democracy relevant kinds, as well as what can go wrong with each. The general form of trust is that I trust you with some good that's important to me. We can ask two general questions about this form, which will allow us to distinguish a variety of forms of trust, and importantly, distinguish democracy supporting forms of trust from those that are corrosive of democracy. Well, the first question has to do with the kinds of reasons someone might place trust in another. Where do the reasons come from, and are they good reasons? I'm calling this question the question of warrant. Warrants can range from the close and interpersonal, you're my friend, and so I have direct knowledge of your competence and your motivations, to the distant and institutional. I don't know you, but I know that you have a role in an institution that I know, which predicts that you will be both competent, and have my interest in view. Now, the second question is whether I could justify trust relationships to those affected by them. As I've been suggesting, not every kind of trust is good for democracy. Trust is involved in the personalized appeals of authoritarian populists, politicians. Trust relationships provide the social glue for clans, ethnic groups, racial groups, and sectarian religious communities. Trust holds together criminal conspiracies and corrupt exchanges. We can tell the bad forms of trust from democracy supporting trust by asking a very simple question. Is the trust relationship producing bad effects, kind of negative externalities for others? And the test for this is a democracy compatible one. If those who are affected or potentially affected would find the trust relationship acceptable, then it's consistent with democracy. That is, we can judge trust relationships by using a Publius test. Note that every trust relationship involving corruption, crime rackets, race-based associations, or religious cults must remain covert if the trust among members is to be maintained, unless, of course, democratic norms are so weak that they provide no public leverage at all. So these two features of trust relationships, the warrant for a trust judgment and the extent to which trust relationships could be publicly justified provide the tools we need to identify and assess a variety of democratically relevant kinds of trust. And so with this, I'm returning to the key question of the talk. What kinds of trust does a democracy need? There are three general kinds of trust that democracy needs. These I'm calling, following many others, simply social trust, first order institutional trust of government agencies, and second order institutional trust in the rules that organize the political parts of government. We can distinguish good and bad types of trust within each category by asking about the kinds of warrants and the reasons for a trust relationship and whether these reasons could become known to all those affected. The most basic form of trust is social, based on interpersonal relationships. All other forms of trust are derivative. Social trust can go beyond interpersonal relations through a variety of social cues that provide warrants or reasons. The truster may know the trustee, but those may not know the trustee, but may know someone who can warrant the trustee's trustworthiness. Social mediation in this way extends the reach of interpersonal warrants, producing what might be called associative trust, the building blocks of social capital. Associative trust is the basis of people's capacities to do things for themselves. Again, a key idea in Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Social trust can also be generalized, built on widely shared norms, which people might infer from membership in some kinds of religious congregations or social movements or even nationalities. Such norms can be relatively exclusive, as in sectarian religions, or they can be relatively universal, as in the general ethic that one has a moral duty to care for others. Generalized trust describes a situation in which people hold norms that motivate them to be generous and even altruistic toward strangers. Generalized trusters will assume, all other things being equal, that their interests are congruent with others, and even that most interests are plus sum. If we trust one another, we can cooperate in ways that will benefit all of us. For these reasons, it's now widely held that generalized trust is good for democracy. This is why the slide that I showed at the beginning of the talk, showing a drop-off in generalized trust in the US, is of concern. We are not as distrustful in the US as people are, say, in Mexico or Russia. But we are moving away from very high trust societies, such as Sweden. By the way, here's another little graph from the World Values Survey. This is the last wave. And the data shows that Germany, with respect to generalized trust, now looks more like the US than it looks like Sweden. But as I've already noted, not all forms of social trust are good for democracy, as some kinds support things like clientelism and protection rackets. So for example, the now unfortunately famous post-war Italian system of political corruption was based on a refined version of socially mediated protective trust that often worked through Masonic lodges. While the Italian case was maybe extreme amongst the developed democracies, most include some subcultures that build on socially mediated protective trust. Wealthy groups that contribute to political campaigns, for example, may not ask for specific favors in return, but they trust that they will have special access in the future. Other kinds of social trust help to build sectarian societies, a pattern that scholars have been calling particularized trust. I trust you if you are part of the same family, clan, ethnicity, religious sect, and so on. At best, particularized trust generates rigid societies within which democracy is unable to do its creative work. At worst, it can reinforce downward leveling norms of the kind famously described in Edward Banfield's late 1950s book, The Moral Basis of Backward Society. As you'll recall, Banfield tells the story of Montegrano, a fictitious composite of several real towns in southern Italy. Inhabitants of Montegrano regard those outside their families with distrust, envy, and suspicion, so much so that they're unable to organize even the most basic collective actions for common benefit, leaving them locked into social isolation and poverty. There's yet another permutation of social trust that's important for democracies, a trust that's built through the media. A truster may not know the trusted, but within the information-saturated media environment of today, the truster can have some confidence that much is known about their trustworthiness. In principle, media scrutiny of, say, the trustees' finances and sources of income, the relationship between their words and deeds, competence, and other such information can be revealing of the trustees' incentives, interests, and capacities in this way, providing warrants for trust or distrust. So in principle, the media can underwrite or undermine public confidence in public figures. This said, trust in the media is itself, as you know, in free fall, driven by social media, segmentation of media markets, saturation of coverage of political entrepreneurs who specialize in spin, and probably the media's own discourse of distrust. Citizens often use and increasingly use media selectively, trusting only those media sources that confirm their opinions, which will, of course, reinforce partisan hostilities and distrust much more than they should. Of particular concern from a democratic perspective are those trusters who treat mediated trust warrants in exactly the same ways that they would treat social cues, focusing on the trustee's demeanor, dress, eye contact with cameras, appearance with family or friends at church, race, gender, and other kinds of social cues. Of course, in the US, Trump has taken this personalized style of mediated trust to an extreme, arguing that he alone is to be trusted, while every other source of information, particularly the media, but also opposition groups and politicians, should never be trusted. The result is what might be called a mediated clientelism, in which a strong public figure promises personal protection against an untrustworthy and exploitive government, as well as against numerous special interests and foreign powers that have betrayed and suckered the people. Information on policy, ideology, conflicts of interest, and so on become submerged by these claims to offer trustworthy personal protection. The personalized trust embedded in mediated clientelism is of course, deeply corrosive of the institutional trust essential to democracy. So let me turn to institutional trust. When trust is institutionalized, it can occur among strangers. It can extend across time and space. It can be transferred among people as one person inherits the obligations for trustworthiness for another. When institutionalized trust is intact, those kinds of collective capacities that are multiplied through associative relationships can expand to mass and even globalized societies. But the idea of trusting an institution isn't straightforward. Trusting an institution is shorthand for trusting a person who holds an office defined by the rules that define an institution. And here, by the way, I'm following one of your not quite local colleagues, but close offa. Persons are still the entities that are the objects of trust judgments. What distinguishes institutional trust from social trust, however, is that the trustee is usually an anonymous other who could be replaced at any time by another anonymous other. So the trusters will typically know little or nothing about a trustee, except that the trustee holds an office within an institution. Individuals can then infer the trustworthiness of the office holder from the features of the institution. So how is institutional trust possible, even when interpersonal, social, and media-based warrants are not available? Trustworthy institutions need to have three kinds of conditions. First, institutions define the roles and offices within them normatively. Some norms attach explicitly to the role or the office. Others are embedded in the norms of the profession. Trusters and trustees should both be able to know these norms. This kind of knowledge enables trusters to know about the trustee's duties with respect to the truster's interests. Second, the truster needs to have knowledge about the motivations of the trustee to infer trustworthiness. Institutional trust often builds professional norms and incentives into the institution in ways that follow from professional identities. But third, because the truster usually does not have any direct knowledge of the trustee's normative attachment to office, institutions must also have sanctions that are knowable to the truster, that are internal to the mechanism, to the institutions through oversight bodies, the media, watchdog groups, and the like. So even if the trustee has not internalized the norms of office, she still has incentives to behave consistently with them. That is, institutional trust still requires effective means and mechanisms for risk reduction. Individuals must be able to resort to effective monitoring if necessary and if they distrust, or to know that there are trusted others who are monitoring, even if they do not do so themselves. Now, when these elements of warranted trust are publicly available and knowable, institutional trust will be democracy supporting. So now another distinction. So between what I'm calling first order institutional trust and second order institutional trust. The idea of first order institutional trust is simply public trust in those parts of government with missions to provide common goods. Ideally, most government is made up of agencies or ministries with broadly agreed public purposes, such as providing security, roads, consumer protections, regulated markets, banking, securities, transportation, communications, energy, and all the many areas where markets are imperfect or tend to generate negative externalities. Public trust is a kind of first order institutional trust because it follows straightforwardly from the three conditions of institutional trust above. The warrants for public trust are institutional in nature. The norms of the public entities are knowable to the people they affect, and those who hold public offices are subject to sanctions if they depart from the norms. Now, in contrast, what patronage, clientelism, corruption, captured agencies have in common is that they build particularistic forms of trust into public institutions, and these are secured in non-public ways. But another kind of threat comes from politicians, especially from the populist right, who seek political gains by attacking the trustworthiness of public bodies. They tell citizens, trust me, not the government. These kinds of attacks on public institutions are part of the same syndrome as what I was calling mediated clientelism. And of course, these political strategies represent a clear and present danger to the collective capacities of democratic systems to provide common goods. What about trusting political institutions, such as legislatures, institutions that can't meet the conditions of first order trust? It's always in the interest of representatives to appear trustworthy But the partiality of interests and ideologies will often push toward covertness and dissimulation. These conflicting role motivations distinguish politicians from the professionals in agencies and ministries that hold a public trust. So there are no good reasons for citizens to trust politicians in general, although you might trust, your representative. We should, generally speaking, expect distrust, but ideally we should want engaged distrust with citizens using their powers of talking, advocating, voting, organizing, and so on, to ensure that political bargains and compromises are as close to their interests as possible. But engaged distrust requires trust of a different sort. Trust in the rules that channel conflict into the democratic media of talking and voting. This is what I've been calling second order institutional trust. We need to know that our representatives are pursuing goods only through democratic means. We need to know that what representatives say and how they vote are actually producing political decisions, and not, say, a politician's covert attentiveness to wealthy campaign donors. Otherwise, of course, citizen powers of talking and voting lose their force, and citizens have no way of connecting these democratic means of influence to their representatives. So it's not important that we trust politicians. Mostly we probably shouldn't, but it is important that we trust the rules that keep them from pursuing their agendas outside of the democratic media of talking, voting, and the like. This is why, for example, campaign financing regulations, rules about conflict of interests, ethics oversight bodies, and so on are so important. But there's also trouble, at least in some of the developed democracies. In the US, to take the most serious case, deficits of second order trust are pronounced, mostly driven by Trumpism and the conditions that have enabled it, including segmented media markets, social media, floods of special interest money, gerrymandered congressional districts, and a host of other things that have caused the Economist's intelligence unit to drop the US into their flawed democracies category. To wrap up, the relationship between democracy and trust is complex. As Bentham noted, citizens should be distrustful of state powers. Yet citizens who generalize distrust of political elites, political institutions, and of one another will find themselves collectively disempowered. Democratic systems must therefore channel distrust into political institutions that deal with conflict through talking and voting, and they must underwrite the conditions of trust elsewhere, most of all in society and in the government institutions that provide societies with their capacities to collectively provide for themselves. So if democracy is to be strong and viable, we need to treat warranted trust relationships as common pool resources that are both hard to build and unfortunately easy to despoil. Danke schön.